My name is David Comissiong, and I am Barbados's ambassador to the Caribbean community and to the Association of Caribbean States. My topic is the Anglophone Caribbean: struggles, resistance, and restorative justice for Afro-descendant peoples, resistance actions against genocide and colonial exploitation. So let me go straight to the heart of the matter. In 1834, after 225 years of relentless rebellion by our enslaved ancestors, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. And the methodology devised by the British government for the abolition of slavery was to calculate the capital or labor value of the then existing population of enslaved African human beings supposedly owned by the British slave masters, and to compensate not our enslaved ancestors, but the slave masters for their loss of property. The value of that generation of enslaved Africans was calculated at £47 million and was paid out as follows: £20 million in a cash payment to the slave masters and £27 million in free labor that our supposedly newly freed ancestors were obliged to give to their supposed former enslavers during an apprenticeship period of 6 years. Now, that 1834 payment of £47 million was the equivalent of £178.6 billion in today's money values. Indeed, the sum of money was so large, some 40% of the annual budget of the British government, that the said British government borrowed money and issued government bonds in order to pay off the compensation that they extended to the slave masters. And would you believe that the last payments that were made by the British government on those slave owners' compensation bonds were made in the year 2015, a mere 5 years ago? So much so for their argument that the reparations claim is a matter of ancient history. It's very recent history. And that £178.6 billion valuation was for one generation of enslaved Africans. It had nothing to do with the multiple generations of enslaved Africans who were worked to death on the plantations of the Caribbean. Furthermore, that £178.6 billion valuation had nothing to do with the 225 years of whippings, mutilations, castrations, burning to death, beheadings, starvings, rapes, branding with hot iron, hangings, and breaking at the wheel, or with the horrors of the Middle Passage. Indeed, we all need to be conscious of the fact that the world's first concentration camps were not in 1930s Nazi Germany. Rather, they were right here in the Caribbean. They were the creation of the British and were located in such mid-17th century British slave colonies as Barbados and Jamaica. The slave plantation of the mid-17th century was the first concentration camp, a place of extreme and compressed totalitarian terrorism. It should also be noted that 178.6 billion pounds had nothing to do with the destruction wrought on the continent of Africa itself. The destruction of towns, villages, and kingdoms, the mass kidnappings, the displacement of millions of people, the plague of European diseases, the decimation of people and livestock, the depopulation of Africa, the disruption of Africa's historical developmental process and trajectory. Nor did that 178.6 billion pounds have anything to do with the unjust enrichment from which Britain and Europe profited. The development of Europe's massively wealthy industrial civilization at the expense of the plundering and underdevelopment of Africa and of the sons and daughters of Africa in the Caribbean and the Americas. The development of European shipping, shipbuilding, manufacturing industry, and agro-processing industry. The infrastructural development in the form of harbors, docks, canals, heavy engineering works, and major cities. The development of banking and insurance, and of a multiplicity of family and company fortunes that financed and endowed a multiplicity of institutions, inclusive of universities. It is against this background, therefore, that in July 2013, the 15 heads of government of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, made an historic decision to launch a reparations claim against the governments of the relevant European states for one, the genocide perpetrated against the 15 million indigenous people of the Caribbean, and two, the multiplicity of crimes against humanity that were committed against the enslaved Black or African people of the Caribbean. Having made this decision at a CARICOM Heads of Government conference to embark upon a reparations campaign, the Caribbean Heads of Government then commenced the task of establishing an institutional structure to carry out the campaign. The infrastructure that they have established to date is as follows. Firstly, national reparations committees. The government of each member state of CARICOM has established a national reparations committee tasked with the mission of carrying forward the reparations effort at the national level. Two, a CARICOM Reparations Commission. The chairperson of each National Reparations Committee are brought together as members of a region-wide CARICOM Reparations Commission that is charged with primary responsibility for conceptualizing, constructing, and guiding the CARICOM Reparations campaign. The chairperson of the CARICOM Reparations Committee is internationally acclaimed historian and educator, Sir Hilary Beckles. Number three, CARICOM Reparations Research Center. The CARICOM Reparations Commission is assisted in its work by a CARICOM Reparations Research Center that has been established at the Jamaica campus of the Regional University of the West Indies. And fourth, the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations. The CARICOM Reparations Commission reports to and receives policy guidance from a 6-member Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations that is chaired by the Prime Minister of Barbados, and that includes the Prime Ministers or Presidents of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Guyana, Haiti, Suriname, and the Prime Minister, who is the current chairperson of CARICOM. Needless to say, the CARICOM reparations campaign has developed significantly since being launched in July 2013. By early 2014, the CARICOM Reparations Commission had designed a CARICOM reparatory justice program centered on a CARICOM reparations 10-point plan that consists of 1, a formal apology from the governments of the relevant European nations. 2, a voluntary repatriation program for those diasporans who are interested in physically returning to the continent of Africa. 3, an indigenous people development program. 4, a program to establish relevant and needed cultural institutions in the Caribbean. 5, a program to deal with the Caribbean's public health crisis. 6, an education development program for the Caribbean. 7, an African knowledge program for people of the Caribbean component of the African diaspora. 8, a systematic effort at psychological rehabilitation and healing from the traumas of the centuries of genocide and enslavement. 9th, a technology transfer program. And 10, a process of debt cancellation of the national debts of CARICOM member states. And subsequently, in October of 2017, the CARICOM Reparations Commission added the following 3 additional demands. 11 then, the establishment of a Caribbean Sustainability Fund to be financed by the relevant European nations or governments. 12, the removal from places of public celebration all monuments and statues of historical personalities who were implicated in the crime of enslavement. And finally, that October 12th, the day on which Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in the year 1492 and commenced the African Holocaust, be designated Caribbean Holocaust Day. Furthermore, in January 2016, the summit of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, passed a motion endorsing the CARICOM claim for reparations. The CARICOM reparations claim was also subsequently endorsed by the summit of the Association of Caribbean States. And in May 2018, the government of Venezuela held an international conference on reparations in Caracas and endorsed the CARICOM Reparations Initiative, established an Afro-Venezuelan Reparations Commission, and pledged to establish a Reparations Research Center. Since then, there have been a number of reparations settlements at the level of civil society. For example, in August 2019, the University of Glasgow in Scotland admitted its complicity in African enslavement and entered into an agreement with the University of the West Indies to provide UWI with £20 million in funding for educational and research programs. And in October 2019, the USA's Princeton Theological Seminary admitted its implication in African enslavement and offered a reparations package to the African American student community of $27 million. These types of civil society reparations settlements are, however, mere subsidiary settlements that are helping to establish the principle of the legitimacy of reparations and that are helping to create an irresistible momentum towards the substantive reparations settlement that must take place at the governmental level between the governments of the Caribbean and other regions of the former colonial world that experienced African enslavement, and the relevant governments of Europe and North America. So far as the Caribbean community is concerned, our ultimate objective must be to reach the stage where either, one, the political leadership of CARICOM sits down around a negotiating table with the political leadership of the relevant European nations and, in good faith, negotiates our reparations claim. Or, on the basis of United Nations resolutions endorsed by the vast majority of the international community, the UN establishes a special international tribunal specifically designed to deal with our reparations claim in all of its complexity and profundity. Such a final and decisive reparations reckoning cannot be the task of any civil society organization or of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Rather, it has to be the task of our governments operating at the highest level of the international system and utilizing all of the resources available to them. Our attorneys general and ministries of legal affairs, the work of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, the CARICOM Reparations Research Center and its team of lawyers, and the work of the National Reparations Committees. However, the Caribbean community would be well advised to seek out all of its natural allies as it seeks to carry forward this monumental struggle. Allies in the form of progressive nations and governments of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Our initial effort should be to organize and consolidate a worldwide reparations campaign and to develop such reparations campaign into an international cause célèbre, similar in size, power, and scope to the anti-apartheid movement of the 1970s and the 1980s. I would therefore like to conclude by asserting that as we now reach the midpoint of the United Nations International Decade for people of African descent, that we should resolve to use the rest of this decade to organize such a worldwide reparations campaign. I thank you.